I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Greg Dixon, and I am the chair of the Pacific Northwest AES section. I'd like to welcome you all to our meeting tonight. We have a special guest, Joanna Fang, who will be talking about Foley. So we're really excited about her presentation tonight. And I have a few brief announcements before we get started. First, if you can, during Joanna's presentation tonight, please turn off your mics and cameras during the presentation. We want to dedicate the focus to her. And if you can, also, please use your real name. Here, we like to use our real names here in our meetings. So if you click in the right corner, or if you look in the right corner of your picture in Zoom, you can choose to rename. And if you can use your first and last name, we'd appreciate that.
Except not right now, because we've got that disabled.
Oh, okay. Let me know when that is enabled, and I'll let people know again. In addition, if you have questions for the presenter or comments, please leave those in the chat, and I will be helping moderate. So when there's a good opportunity to answer those questions, I'll ask them to the presenter. And then following our meeting this evening, if you would like to stick around and socialize a little bit, we are going to stick around for a bit for quick intros and a little bit of socializing after the event. So please stick around if you'd like to be a part of that. Next month, our next meeting is going to be on June 22nd at 6 p.m. and that is also going to take place on Zoom. And I'm going to let Dan Mortensen talk a little bit more about that meeting in just a sec, but the part that I want to talk about is the election. So next month is our annual June election, and again, that's going to be on June 22nd. Currently, the slate of officers and candidates for the event are as follows. Dan Mortensen is running for chair for a one-year term. Bob Smith is running for vice chair for a one-year term. Gary Louie is running for secretary for a one-year term. Lawrence Schwedler running for treasurer for a one-year term. And for the committee, Janie Wallach for a one-year term. Greg Dixon for a two-year term. Gordon McGregor for a two-year term. Jim Rondinelli for a two-year term. And James D. or J.J. Johnston for a two-year term. And currently we have one open committee position. So if you're interested in being involved with the AES committee, you can send me a private message tonight and I can give you more information about how to get started with that. At this point in time, I'd like to turn the time over to Dan Mortensen, a committee member of the AES Pacific Northwest section, to talk a little bit about next month's meeting with Bill Hanley. And Dan is also going to talk a little bit about a weekly event that he hosts on Zoom every Saturday. So Dan, take it away.
Great, thanks, Greg. Hey, everybody. So on June 22nd, we're going to talk to Bill Hanley, who did the sound for the original Woodstock, which had a interesting story getting to where it finally wound up, and had an interesting story with how many people showed up to it and how they could all hear, which is a huge reason why the festival was so successful in terms of keeping the vibe like it should have been. And what we're going to do is follow the signal path through the PA systems and the audio recording system, which he provided all of the gear for both of those, and look at what was there and how they did it back then. And that's going to be the meeting. And you'll be able to talk to him and ask him questions about details. And he likes details. He doesn't like to hear what was it like at Woodstock. He wants to say, what kind of compressor were you using and what kind of settings did you have on it? He loves that kind of stuff. And he's 80 something years old now, and is doing great, and he comes to our Tea Time Topics meetings on Saturdays. And I guess that'll be a segue to that. So when the pandemic was happening, we decided to take advantage of this format and do kind of a free form meeting where people came up with things they wanted to talk about or hear about or present to other people. And this next Saturday is the 86th in that series. And the subject, and Janie, correct me, jump in here. Janie is going to help us. This is going to be kind of an experiment about the title is of this video is cassette.
Hang on, it's a cassette mixtape. Let me get
There's a documentary about the cassette
yeah, and the
tape and mixed how people used it to create mixtapes. It
right,
has a bunch of cool people in it.
and it also has interviews with the people who created the first cassette tapes. So
Yeah.
that's
So
what
for
should be
us, this
cool.
is going to be an experiment to watch a video and not necessarily linearly watch it, but discuss it. And there's some fun people who show up. And if you want to be part of it, we start at 3, the doors open at 3 p.m. Seattle time, Pacific Daylight Time, which is Universal Time, UTC -7, whatever that is, wherever you are. And the actual presentation starts at 3:30, and we always go until 7 at least, and talk about all kinds of stuff. There's people show what they've been working on, and they come with questions that they have about an audio subject, and often people can answer them. And that's actually true of this group too. You could do that tonight during the self-introductions when you tell us what your connection to audio is. But that's those two things. So back to Greg, I think, right?
All right. Thank you, Dan. At this point in time, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker tonight. Joanna Feng is an Emmy Award-winning Foley artist and sound editor. An alumna of NYU Film, Joanna spent the first 12 years of her career performing custom Foley and sound effects for film and TV in New York with Alchemy Post Sound. Having transitioned into interactive work, Joanna was recently brought on to co-lead and develop Sony PlayStation's in-house Foley team. Her Foley can be heard in films such as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, video games such as Horizon Forbidden West, and even music videos including Mitski's Working for the Knife. Without further ado, please welcome Joanna Feng.
Hi, everyone. How's it going this evening? I am very, very grateful and honored to be your presenter. And I'd like to start off by explaining exactly where we are here in this beautiful Foley stage located at Sony PlayStation San Diego facility in Sorrento Valley, San Diego. This room was custom built and designed specifically for the creation of Foley sound effects for games and multimedia. And it has been an absolute pleasure and treat to take ownership of this stage and craft and build new exciting possibilities here. Today's presentation, I'd like to start off by disclaiming that it's hopefully a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? A little bit fun. I am very much a big fan of interesting PowerPoints nonetheless, and I've written out a PowerPoint for everyone to enjoy. But before we get too much into it, I'd like to start off by saying that a lot of what I discuss in today's presentation, I talk quite a bit about in a blog I wrote for prosoundeffects.com called The Other F Word, What is Foley in the 21st Century? A link will be provided in the chat, and any sort of relevant link we see in tonight's presentation will be presented in chat by our lovely host, Greg Dixon. If anyone has a question, feel free to ask it in chat, and I will slow down, and Greg, if you can, let me know if a question has popped up and I can try to answer it in the moment. So for now, let me go ahead and get my slideshow going. It's been a very long time since I've gotten into PowerPoint, but let me get my sharing going, and hopefully these will be good visual cues for the visual learners in the room. Share screen. All right, and let's go. Reality is boring. Expressing feelings and movements through impressionistic Foley. This is going to be a rant disguised as a presentation by yours truly, Joanna Fang. That being said, I'm not the biggest fan of PowerPoints in terms of, just reading off of them. So we'll use this really as a launch pad for some of the discussions tonight. A disclaimer. I'm a big fan of disclaimers, I guess. The following presentation contains opinions of my own and are not representative of Sony PlayStation, its brands, nor its products. It has been modified from its original version and formatted to fit this screen. I do not represent PlayStation. I am, however, an employee here and very happy to be part of leadership. So it must be said, and it also must be said that I am under significant non-disclosure agreements. So any sort of questions regarding the current titles I'm on, we're gonna have to wait for maybe a year or two before the game's release before I can publicly mention anything about it. But luckily, I have a very long and storied career in the film and television industry, and I've been cleared to discuss some of the more general aspects of interactive Foley, enough so that I believe that we can have this lovely presentation. So who exactly am I? My name's Joanna Kimberly Fang, sorry. I am the senior Foley artist at Sony PlayStation. I was born and raised in Southern California in a little town called San Marino, California. And I lived there all the way until I was 18. And growing up, I was a musician. I started practicing classical voice as a very young girl. And I was very lucky to be able to grow and learn and build my musical talent while I was still in elementary school. And this was a really, really big part of my life. For the longest time, I was completely convinced that I was going to be a great singer-songwriter. To that end, I actually moved to New York right after high school and started attending New York University. I started off by being in the conservatory at the Steinhardt School of Education, Media, and Communications, I believe is this current title. And I studied music technology there as well as vocal performance. And it was during my time at conservatory that I realized that my love for film was increasingly taking a hold of my life. And I would go to these awesome underground indie shows, and I loved to film and document the music scene in Brooklyn at the time. So much so that I decided after a very intense 2 years in conservatory to transfer to the film school, where upon transferring there, a rumor went around town that I had sight reading skills, and a sound designer by the name of David Miller decided to throw me into the Foley stage to see if I could perform Foley. And it was a pretty scary experience, to say the least, but it made sense to me. I see a film or a moving image like sheet music, and whatever props or shoes that I have are really the instruments that I can use to perform the notes I see on the screen. After graduating NYU with a BFA in film and television from Tisch, I started apprenticing for Leslie Bloom at Alchemy Post Sound, where I was a Foley artist for a really long time, for about 7 years. It was pretty amazing to transition from working on student films and very low budget made for TV horror films into the big leagues and getting to work on some really cool productions and helping them build the Foley stage there. I loved it, and it was a marvelous time, and I'll get into more of that as we go along. And finally, after those 7 years at Alchemy, I decided it was time to move back to sunny California, especially during the pandemic, when I realized that I had personal reasons to move home. And I ended up somehow miraculously getting a position at Sony PlayStation, where we had just finalized this Foley stage, and our needs grew to the point where we needed to have on-site talent. And so I was very lucky and very grateful for the opportunity to be here tonight in this room presenting to you guys. It's been marvelous. So, you know, I have been able to work on a lot of interesting projects over the years. I've worked on films, television shows, video games, podcasts. I've worked on 360 pieces. I've worked on immersive audio events. I've played with Quad. I've worked in 5.1. I've shot Foley for Atmos and all sorts of cool formats. I'm very lucky in the sense that as a Foley artist, I've had a very diverse time. When I was at Alchemy Post Sound, the idea was that if anything moves, we can Foley it. And to that end, some projects I've been very proud to work on include films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Manchester by the Sea, Still Alice. I've done lots and lots of work in television. I was super, super appreciative of being able to work on the last season of Nurse Jackie and Royal Pains. And my favorite show I've ever worked on was Fosse Verdon. And yeah, as you can see, there's an IMDb link. So if anyone would like to go there and look through my CV, feel free to do so. But I've been very lucky to have so many opportunities to create sound effects across so many different media, excuse me, sorry. So my wild presentation is maybe sensationalist. Let's just put it this way. Claiming that reality is boring is a pretty strong assertion, but I'd like to rewind quite a bit to 1929 because the art form I work in really gained its name and notoriety starting in the early eras of talk cinema or of soundies as they were known. But prior to 1929, prior to sound and film, there was a lot of DNA brewing, a lot of primordial ideas being floated around that eventually led to the advent and invention of Foley as we know it. The DNA of that came from, well, let's rewind all the way to the beginning. The very first root of that DNA comes from simple sonic storytelling. We, as a culture, as a anthropology of people who very much care about storytelling. You know, I like to imagine that the earliest hunter-gatherers would hold on to bones of animals they've hunted and clack them together to explain to their fellow tribesmen how they brought down the big beast. So much of Foley, so much of sound effects as storytelling really is rooted in our development as a society. And we kind of reached this pinnacle going into the 1920s because we had vaudeville going on. We had motion picture scores that included sound effects to be played by percussionists. We had radio where sound artists would perform live to the dialogue as it was being performed in the studio. And finally, we have motion pictures, we have film. So the first thing first challenge I'd like to pose to the audience is a simple question. Why is the F capitalized in Foley? And I'll just answer it for the sake of the audience. The F in Foley is capitalized because it represents a real person. It represents Jack Foley. Now, Jack Foley was a Renaissance man. He was a Orange County born and raised Irish American who pretty much dabbled in so many things. He dabbled in the early days of filmmaking. He dabbled in radio. And at the perfect time, at the perfect juncture, as film sound started becoming an actual reality, he was tasked with leading a department of sound artists from the radio world to create sound effects for 1929's Showboat. And from that point on, his mythology has been very much laid out. His side of the stage became known as, Jack Foley's stage. And as the other motion picture companies in Hollywood started realizing that they needed sound effects artists and they needed to have a place for them, the saying of the Foley stage became increasingly part of the lexicon. So That's why the F is capitalized. It represents an actual person. And, sometimes I screw it up. I was going to pose a challenge that every time you see the word Foley in this presentation, if it's not a capital F, to in chat, press F to pay respects to my failures as a Foley artist. But let's go back to a little bit, but like Foley's been around for a very long time, I guess is what I'm trying to say. There's a lot of things that stayed the same. And when it comes down to it, Jack Foley was very much well known for being a walker. You might hear that phrase Foley walker quite a bit. It's kind of fallen out of fashion because of a push by Foley artists to see and be acknowledged as artists and not just as technicians. But to that end, Jack Foley would put a rock in his shoe to mimic certain actors. He would carry a cane with a shoe attached to it in order to do 3 people at once. He was very much true to the idea that footsteps and cloth and creatively performed props could enhance the sonic enjoyment and the sonic experience of a film. That has stayed in a lot of ways the same. What has changed, though, has been a lot of the sound effects that Jack Foley and his team used to handle were created live to picture in the performance. But nowadays, because we have sound effects libraries, we really don't need to have a thunder sheet mounted to create the sound of thunder. But at its most inherent physical quality, Foley has not changed. And through this era of Foley, we built a classical definition of what Foley is. Foley Foley is, it's been used as both singular and plural. It's actually a very confusing linguistical challenge to understand the word Foley. But the classical definition of Foley is that it is custom sound effects performed to sync to picture. So that is to say that for the longest time, what really differentiated a Foley artist from a sound effects editor, from a musician, was really this definition that we were performing to picture. But things have changed. I would like to think of the modern era of Foley to be between the 1990s and the 2020s. It's in this era that we started seeing this rapid technological shift. Digital recording techniques meant that we have miniaturization of sound equipment. So we go from these massive like Fox sound to picture machines that required an entire booth on the scoring stage to properly isolate, to Nagra, finally to, our nowadays 32-bit float 96 kilohertz field recorders. This digital innovation has given us obviously much better signal to noise ratio, as well as highly expanded the width and breadth of sound effects libraries that do exist out in the world. And we'll get into that in a bit. There's also been another massive change in this modern era, and it's simply put the advent of the internet. So thanks to FTPs, we're able to transfer entire reels of films to one another across the world. We're able to have a Foley team in, let's say, Peekskill, New York, which is where Alchemy was based, have a Foley team there work on Hollywood films. We're able to create Foley pretty much anywhere and everywhere. And thanks to, the internet and high bandwidth, specifically high bandwidth internet, we're able to have remote sessions where folks can actually tune in and watch Foley be performed in real time. We also have the advent of the internet in the form of social media. We have this changing anthropology of sound. And I think that's actually a really big topic that kind of gets forgotten about when we talk about, modern audio engineering. Our idea of how sound operates, our idea of meaningful, impactful notes of sound have changed due to social media, due to YouTube, as well as archiving unique sounds. We're able to rapidly go from recording sounds in incredibly remote places and upload it onto servers and rapidly and very uniquely archive and document large amounts of sounds that were previously inaccessible. We also have changing responsibilities in film. Thanks to all these technological innovations, we're actually having to redefine Foley in the sense that sound effects editors are more capable nowadays of going through sound effects libraries or bringing their miniaturized recording equipment out in the field to record sound effects and to take archived, forensic, unique sound effects from the wild and bring them into films. And the result is that Foley has had to increasingly focus on sounds that are either hard to capture or require a performative gestalt to them. We also have the change of new media. We have all these different forms of interactive entertainment like video games, virtual reality, and 360 video. We have podcasts where we kind of essentially having this revival, this renaissance of radio. And we now have this new anthropology of sound that affects all these new forms of media. We also have a changing aesthetic of Foley. Foley itself has changed as a result of everything coming before it. Our idea of what good Foley sounds like, what bad Foley sounds like has changed. Our idea of what good sync has changed. Our idea of what are the most important details to get from the Foley stage have changed. And finally, authorship has changed. We're dealing now with Foley systems where we create thousands of unique footsteps that are then triggered by a video game player or some form of procedural triggering. And we also are dealing with Foley performances that are operating without visuals. So the classical definition of Foley, which was so dependent on custom sound effects defined by pictures and performances on screen, suddenly thrust back into a modern world where people are expecting highly performed Foley sound effects without visuals, thereby kind of nullifying our classical definition of what Foley is. To that end, I'd like to kind of open up a little bit and talk about, I've mentioned Foley and Foley artistry in this presentation so far, but I kind of want to slow down and break down what the modern Foley team even looks like. You'll see to the left are two of my mentors and my previous employers from Alchemy. You have Leslie Bloom on the far left. In the middle is me, circa 2016. And on the far right is Ryan Collison, who's a Foley mixer. And for the longest time, I was part of this team, and we were able to do really incredible work in New York. And here's kind of how the division of labor breaks down in a Foley team. You have Foley artists who perform footsteps, props, and clothing. We are the ones who make strong aesthetic choices, and we are also the ones who have to create super dynamic performances. One second, I'm actually going to open up chat just to make sure that we are not accidentally passing through questions. I'm sorry, I'm like blasting, going super fast. And yes, here we are at the Television Academy at the Primetime Emmys and the Creative Arts portion. We won Emmys for a documentary called Cartel Land. Yeah, that's right. Documentaries have tons of Foley in them. And so it's been several years since then, obviously, but I really do cherish this Foley team that I was part of, and were so influential in my life. Basically, the reason why I'm kind of so nostalgic and sentimental about it is because we all relied on each other so much to create great art, right? So obviously the Foley team is often, presumed to just be the work of, like, good Foley is often presumed to just be the creative expression of one artist. The truth is that there's so many artists, even at one Foley team or at one Foley stage. And to that end, at Alchemy, I was part of a 2-person Foley team. So we had Les, who was my mentor, who is an industry veteran who's shot Foley for hundreds upon hundreds of projects. He was like my mentor. He was my Foley Ubermensch. And he would train me in a lot of the oral traditions of Foley. And it was really a lot of my idea of what good Foley sounds like does in fact come from Les, but it also comes from Ryan there, who is a Foley mixer. You might have heard the phrase Foley mixer, Foley recordist, or Foley recording engineer. There's so many different ways to describe the Foley mixer, but really the Foley mixer guides the Foley artists. They're the second pair of ears on any sound we create. They often operate in a highly collaborative process where they use plugins and outboard equipment to shape the Foley. And oftentimes they're asked to do this live and to have the results of their effects be printed directly into the session. So often people will think that a lot of the perspective in Foley is created during the final process of film mixing. But the truth is, nowadays, with how there's an expectation for the Foley to be presented as close to final, has put an incredible amount of pressure and artistry in the hands of the Foley mixer, to which end Ryan is also providing his own aesthetic sensibilities, his own acoustic sensibilities, and in a way directing myself or Les to create the Foley in a particular way. And finally, you have Foley editors. And unfortunately, in this photo, the Foley editor is actually me. The Foley editor's job is to kind of ingest all the media that's coming in. So if we're working on a film and it's split up into 5 reels, they're going to be the ones who first bring in all the media, set up a Pro Tool session or whatever DAW is flavor of choice. And what they're going to first do is they're going to watch the whole film and then start targeting in Pro Tools each and every moment that needs a sound effect. And they're going to label these little pieces of data as Foley cues. And so they'll tell us what exactly is the sound, what shoe type, what surface, what character, how long the performance has to last in this one section, as well as any other props and clothing materials that need to be notated. That's incredibly important, Foley cueing. Often the Foley editor will be also the person to edit and sync up the Foley after it's been recorded. So I think a misnomer is the idea that Foley is somehow magically sample accurate. The truth is Foley artists are human, and that we on average are off by anywhere from 3 to 6 frames, because that's just how long it takes to react to something on screen. Usain Bolt off the when Usain Bolt hears the firing gun, the starter gun at a race, he takes about 250 milliseconds to get off the blocks. So you can translate that to chubby Foley artist Joanna Fang. It's like, I'm no Usain Bolt, and I think I have pretty decent sync, but oftentimes we're Foley artists are like out by just a little bit. And so what a Foley editor's job is to a part of their job is to take all the Foley that's been recorded as tight to sync as possible and give it that extra 3 to 6 frame push, or to sync it up against reference audio from production. Let's say that we're working on a project like Fosse Verdon, where there's actually a lot of tap dancing and a lot of tap shoes. They're going to need to line up each and every little transient that was recorded on set with the Foley reproduction or the Foley performance that was created later. They also often have to work by frame reference. And so that mean that how many milliseconds is 6 frames? Roughly around 300 milliseconds. Let me see if my math is correct, because if you're working on 24 frame audio or 24 frames per second film, 6 divided by 24 is 1/4, so a quarter of a second, right? So that's 250 milliseconds roughly. And so if you think about it, that makes sense that, if Usain Bolt needs 250 milliseconds to get off the blocks, then I like to hope that means that Foley artists are allowed to be 6 frames out of sync or behind sync. And so the Foley editor is really important. And they're also like the final gatekeepers. They're the final deciding factors as to whether or not the Foley has achieved the aesthetic, performative, and technical needs of the production. To that end, I'll answer that question. How do we decide to do Foley for a documentary? In a really fascinating way, I think a lot of the big documentaries, it's all filmmaking. It's like a documentary itself is still very much a curated experience that has been lensed. It's been edited together to present a truth, and often that the truth of what we see in the documentary requires a certain amount of curatorial or performative enhancement to make sure that the experience of watching that documentary resembles the truth of being there. So in a lot of ways, Foley for documentaries isn't necessarily such a strange thing. It actually makes a lot of sense that you would like to have a human sound artist create and curate sound effects that accurately represent the truth of what we see. And that truth goes beyond the fidelity of recordings on the field. It goes beyond, audio clipping out because the filmmaker's in a gun battle with drug cartels, or it transcends necessarily the lack of audio if they're unable to pull out the shotgun mic in the middle of a firefight. And so a lot of Foley for documentaries is focusing on retaining the human element and not so much about complete forensic reproduction. And we'll get a little bit into that as part of this discussion. One second, let's just move on to this next slide. Like, as I said, the presentation, its title's a little bit sensationalist, and I just want to put this out there. Reality is actually pretty dang cool when it comes to sound. I realized when I wrote the kind of the thesis of this presentation, as I was like working on my initial draft of it, it came to mind that I was like, ooh, I might have offended like field sound recordists or people whose work is in reality, like people like many people in this Zoom chat who are creating sounds or providing haptic feedback or listening to sounds very much in the real world with real world results and real world consequences. And I really wanted to first stipulate that reality is really cool. Everything is based in reality. And to that end, I'll talk about what about reality is super cool when it comes to sound. First of all, thanks to these digital innovations, we're able to capture sounds nowadays anywhere, everywhere, all at once. However, I will say that capturing sounds in the real world does provide a really harsh reality check often. How often is it that we hear an interesting sound out there, and when we point a shotgun mic at it, or we are able to, isolate that sound, it turns out that it maybe wasn't quite as good as you remember it. I always feel like we can always blame the microphone or the recording as to why we weren't able to capture the whole essence of a sound. But the truth is, experiencing a sound and being there with it is so different than the, .wav file that gets imported into Pro Tools at the end of the night. Capturing sounds in reality, it gives us that harsh reality check. As a result, we have this increasing sonic disreality in films and a very strange expectation that reality sounds closer to films. The truth is, reality sounds like reality, and films are really where the metaphors lie. Films are really where the exaggeration lies. And we're kind of having this weird feedback loop where, often I'm tasked with recreating something that happened either in a documentary or a film, and having to give the harsh reality check that the real object, even when I'm handed the exact prop that was used on set, often does not adequately translate the experience of having been there. And that's not a fault of reality. I think that's a fault of our own psychoacoustics. Reality is really cool in the sense that we have so much inspiration from those lived experiences. I posted a YouTube link here of there is a orphanage in India where the how do I put this? The patron of that orphanage has to provide massive quantities of food for these kids. And so when I say inspiration from lived experiences, the fact that you can click on that YouTube link and watch this guy cook like hundreds of pounds of like fried chicken or noodles to feed starving kids. I mean, like, if you want to talk about being able to compare what does 1,000 fried chickens sound like? Well, you have that now, thanks to reality. And we also have other ways that reality is really cool. We have psychoacoustics. Obviously, we have all these cool little cheat codes that we use to trick people. You have Fletcher-Munson curves, aka equal loudness curves, that kind of are the bane of so many music and re-recording mixers' existence, is to try to convince a director or a musician that the mix is going to work, and that if we were to crank the master volume knob of the console while we're mixing, that we might accidentally undercompensate for bass or overcompensate for bass. We also have cool things like Huffman encoding, where we're able to cheat the human ear into not necessarily needing full bandwidth of audio. And finally, Foley artists in the wild get the opportunity to really play with what's real and what isn't. We get to listen to all these unique and beautiful things that exist out in the real world, but we also get to listen to the silence. We get to listen to moments where we expected there to be sound, but the truth is there isn't any. When I shake somebody's hand, we learn so much about that person. But the truth is, if I were to record the sound of me shaking somebody's hand, that sound on playback would not convey the massive amount of information that I perceive from a handshake. And so reality is reality. It has its interesting features. It has its expectations, and it has all of this autonomy that is far, far away from human perception. So that being said, something I've always had to explain to people is that Foley as an art follows a lot of fine art, in the sense that what we're trying to do is create sounds, perform sounds that when listened to trigger a reaction. I've called it weaponized ASMR. We're attempting to convey the experience of having gone through an environment or interacted with characters, and take sound and use it as the method with which we deeply immerse our viewer. To that end, there's a lot of misconception that Foley artists are operating in the photoreal. As I said before, we often are tasked with recreating reality in a very forensic way. We're told which shoes people wear, and sometimes they'll send us props from the film to use. But the truth is, when it comes to creating those sounds that translate that feeling, oftentimes the real props or the one-to-one forensic recreation does not convey enough about what the story is trying to say to us. To that end, I liked us to look at this beautiful bridge that was done by Monet. It's called the Waterloo Bridge. It's also, in my mind, the bridge towards modernity. You know, we could see in the background the haze of these smokestacks. And even though we know this is not a high fidelity image and is not photoreal, it conveys so much about the light. You know, 19th century Impressionism is all about these quick, short brush strokes that are attempting to immerse us in the feeling of what it means to be seeing. And so I draw a lot of my personal inspiration for Foley through this sort of lensing, that we're trying to create sounds that have been lived through. And as part of our tools and tactics, we can choose light brush strokes. We can choose to obscure certain details or to bring out certain details. When I look at this painting, I can see the wispiness of the smoke rising and how that ties into the currents of the wind above it. I can see the ebb and flow of water. And all of these things are not necessarily recreated in a way that requires photorealism, if that makes sense. And so when it comes to my inspirations as a Foley artist, I often think people immediately want to ask me about what's the goofiest sound you've ever done, or what's the most wild cheat you've ever done, right? What's the weirdest thing you've used to create the sound of another weird thing? And while I can give a lot of really fun answers, and maybe I will, if you guys have questions about, you know, what are the strangest things you've used to cheat a sound, more than happy to answer them. But I think it has to be said that even when we aren't cheating sound, even when we are stuck with the real thing and just recreating it, everything requires a performative expression in order to get it to translate. To that end, I kind of focus on painters. I think there's a lot to be learned from all throughout the fine art field when it comes to Foley artistry. After all, we do share the title of art. in which case, you know, I always ask people to be inspired by painting, to be inspired by fine art, because, you know, at some point there's only so many mix with the masters you can listen to. There's only so many hours of Foley sessions you can sit in on. There's only so many films you could watch and you know, Soundworks collections to break down. But when it comes to generating unique and new ideas and trying to transcend the homogenization of sound effects, we can turn and look at other forms of art. To which end, I've been a huge fan of Andrew Wyeth, who is a 20th century realist who would actually live with his subjects, and he would live with them for years. He would rent out rooms and he would talk to the owners while drawing their portraitures. And it's an incredibly moving way of creating art, because Andrew Wyeth taught me that there's so many life experiences that I'll never know. I'll never know what it's like to fight in a war. I'll never know what it's like to be an EMT. I'll never know what it's like to be anything that I'm not. And so as a Foley artist, I'm often tasked with translating those performances, translating those experiences. And so Wyeth taught me that even if we are tasked with creating something that's going to be, you know, up in a museum, or in the case of Foley at its most humble, muted in the mix, that subject matters deserve that type of empathy and deserve that type of research. I love Jackson Pollock because he's an abstract expressionist. You know, he believes that how you create the art, the way you move as you create the art, heavily influences what you see. As to whether or not some of his splatter paintings convey his anger, his alcoholism, his depression, I think maybe we'll leave that up to each individual viewer to decide. But I think there's something incredibly moving about attempting to very much use the movement and the performance art itself as a way of generating unique and interesting Foley art. And the last person I like to think about is David Choi, who is a contemporary artist. I don't know if we can call his genre anything besides art punk. You know, he is somebody who uses mixed media, combines graffiti, blood, sometimes his own waste product to create these incredibly moving pieces. And some of his pieces don't even exist as paintings, in the sense that he will draw over them. He will film himself creating the sound and then destroying, not creating the sound, excuse me. You can see why my brain kind of sees them as one and the same. But he will create an image and rapidly prototype it and remove it and try new things and constantly rewrite and recreate. For me as a Foley artist, nothing is sacred. If I create a sound that works really well, but might have some flaws to it, I have no fear in just doing it one more time, taking another stab at it. And so David Choi is my inspiration so far as remembering that everything's ephemeral, that at the end of the day, you know, if the Foley is not good, it will get muted in mix. And that sometimes, even if the Foley's fully embodied and lived in and well performed and well recorded, that if the film or the game or the podcast needs this to be a music cue, that it's okay for the art to be painted over and forgotten. I'm gonna switch out of the presentation mode right now and kind of just go back to us here at Sony PlayStation. You know, I think I've discussed a lot of really big brain ideas, I guess. And I want to just say that, like, you know, when it comes to the pretension of Foley, it's very easy for us to get back down to the simple basics of what we do, the elegance of what we do, which is that ultimately we're watching these soundless moments and trying to score them with something that moves the audience. And isn't that true for all of us here? Isn't that true for every sound effects editor? Isn't that true for every dialogue editor? Isn't that true for people who are working on preamps, that we're all just trying and struggling to create something that conveys a feeling? And so to that end, I think one of the big epidemics of thought that I see when it comes to Foley, when it comes to other people's perception of Foley, is that the biggest difference between what's happening in here and what's happening out there is the fact that we have sound absorption panels. Some people don't see a Foley stage as a place of art. They see it as a place of forensic recording. They see it as a place of recreating reality inside these four walls. And simply the act of doing so should be enough to get a film to sound correct. when the truth is that this is a place of inspiration. It has more to do with an art studio. It has more to do with being a comfortable place where I can thrive. To which you could see it's incredibly messy. They say never trust a clean Foley stage, because it means it's not being used. But it is also a place where I'm able to express myself. It's a place where I'm able to hop into that massive water pit that's behind the car door and literally swim and paddle to create the sound of let's say like a lizard disappearing under the waves, you know. We're dealing with a world that is increasingly virtualized. We're creating a world where we are starting to recreate reality in virtual space, right? Like we have metaverses, and we're increasingly seeing this retreat from reality into curated virtual environments. And I think Foley has a huge part to play in that future. And I'm already seeing that here at PlayStation. However, we are dealing with this issue where we believe that we can just record the world. And that if we just record the world, and if we just plop it into the game or plop it into the virtual reality space, that somehow the final product is as moving as actually experiencing the world, which isn't necessarily true. I think at this point, like, we can probably move into questions. I feel like I've had my piece. I feel like I've had a chance to express this thesis. And so maybe let's take some questions from the audience.
Joanna, thank you. That was really thought-provoking and awesome stuff. There was a question from Dan that was asking, can you talk a little bit about the sound of gunshots in film and the different choices, how they relate to reality? They are audibly all over the map from production to production.
Yeah. So here's the fascinating thing about like guns and weaponry, right? So the joke I always have with Foley specifically is that when you hear a gun in a film or in a game, Foley's job is to handle this expression of moving the firearm in the space, right? And so often when you watch a film, even if it's a movie where you have like special forces troops operating in the dead of night, you're going to hear all their gear and all their firearms. And that's actually a result of that cinematic disreality, right? That's a result of us having an expectation of how guns should sound in a film versus the reality, which is that guns, for the most part, should not rattle if you were to pan them. You know, they should not rattle if you're a Navy SEAL going on like a black op. You know what I mean? Like, the gun's loudest sound should be the firing of the trigger, right? This massive expulsion of gas and heat. That being said, talking about gunshots in films and gun sounds in general and how they relate to reality, if you think about what gunshots are, they're essentially super loud impulses, right? There's massive blasts. So much of what the sound of a gun and the sound of a bullet doesn't necessarily come from, you know, this cartridge side or the gunpowder load, although some would say that's the defining elements of that. But as we've learned, is that a gunshot actually very much gives you environmental feedback, right? So if I were to take like a 9mm Glock and fire it, you know, in a small room versus a large room, one could argue that what shaped and contoured the sound of that pistol was more the environment than the actual round or the gunpowder load or the length of the barrel, right? So gunshots in films are often an opportunity to create contrast and dynamics, right? So the classic example is the Joker in The Dark Knight Rises. His Glock 18 fires, when you hear it's actually the sound of a Gatling gun, because we're trying to use it as an impressionistic way to convey the violence and lethality of what you hear. At the same time, you know, when you hear him pull the magazine out or put it back in, that's a Foley team, you know, often with a like can opener and like a piece of like, and like a tin of mints and like smacking that towards together. So there's a lot about how that's an impressionistic opportunity, no different than the way that like in opera, especially in like Wagnerian operas, where it's like the vocal range is part of the storytelling in terms of like who's the protagonist, who's the antagonist, right? So it's an opportunity to take this thing that's incredibly loud and incredibly hard to record properly, and instead of being forced to scope within the literal reality of what a gunshot is and what a gun is, to instead see it as an opportunity to be more expressive with your storytelling.
As a follow-up question to that, Joanna, are there times that there's like ambiguity between who's doing what, if it's the sound designer versus the Foley artist? I would imagine that gunshots typically would be done by a sound designer and not the Foley artist, but then you mentioned like the magazines and other things. But are there times when there's an ambiguity and it's hard to decide, or maybe who decides that?
Right.
Whether the work goes to the sound effects designer or the Foley artist?
That's an amazing question, and it's something I might have touched on a little bit, which is that division of labor, right? So recently, a few colleagues of mine went and recorded guns, and they tried a whole plethora of guns. And when they were there, they were like, let's get some gun Foley, right? So they worked with these like really well-trained shooters to try to capture the sound of the magazines being put in, actions being, bolts being pulled back. I know a lot about firearms because it's part of my job, right? I'm able to identify each part of the gun. But what they realized when they came back from this recording session was that the operators who were performing this Foley, I wouldn't even call it Foley, it's really more like forensic sound effects work, right? Because we're trying to get the real sound of what an actual like M16 reload sounds like, or the real sound of like what an actual Thompson submachine gun reload sounds like. In that point, there is no performance to it. It's being recorded for the widest possible utilitarian use. It's also being performed in a neutral way, because if you are anyone who spent time at the range, you're not supposed to screw around with a gun, right? Like, you have to be very careful with it, and you have to treat it with respect. So when it came time for them to record the sound of magazines and things being pulled back, the recordings were very good in the sense that, okay, hey, that's actually what the sound of an AR-15 sounds like. That's actually the sound of what a Glock sounds like. That's actually the sound of what 9mm sounds like when it's put in the mag. However, because we're operating in this narrative world, this narrative space, exactly, there is no emotions in those recording sessions. So if we're portraying, let's say we're working on this movie, let's say Cartel Land, the movie that we won an Emmy for, there are scenes where you see the militias that are fighting the drug cartels are training with their firearms. So hearing their weapons being reloaded has to have pathos to it. It has to show the aggression with which they're preparing for this battle, So to that end, when it comes to the SFX versus Foley side of the matter, the question is, does SFX produce a dynamic, is SFX able to produce a very dynamic moving sound that tells the story, or do we need Foley to try it because we need to transcend the forensic reality of what was there, right? So in the case of a project like Cartel Land, where we wanted it to very much be in reality, and same with the follow-up documentary City of Ghosts, which is about ISIS, right? These are all like really gonzo documentaries where it's like very high risk, very scary situations being portrayed on camera, awful situations being portrayed on camera. There are accurate recordings of AK magazines being put into the rifle, but there are none that are accurate to the emotion that's happening on screen, right? And so that's the gestalt right there. That's where the sum of the parts transcends. Or excuse me, I said it wrong, but the sum transcends the parts, right? So in those situations, that's where there's that unique inter-exchange between SFX editors and Foley artists. We have to try to get the best of both worlds. At the same time, as a Foley artist, I do accept the feedback that often guns are too noisy in films, or when I talk to service members who've actually served or actually fired certain elements of weapons, they're saying, oh, these guns are so ridiculous in films. And I have to let them know that, like, hey, it's because your experience, your intimacy with this object gives you a completely new perspective. And so often when it comes to my work in terms of like talking to people who've actually experienced the real thing and trying to translate that into sound, we have to play the balancing act between forensic reality and the more impressionistic lived experience side of it, right? Because if I can translate that to an audience member, then I will have achieved my job of getting them to be in the sonic space of the character on screen, right? And so I do have to balance that. And sometimes it's a really hard balance. But yeah, that's an example where division of labor is an option. And like I said, also it's a matter of the director. Let's say the director really likes the sound of the perfectly sonically accurate weapons. For Foley, sometimes we'll actually listen to the literal recording and then try to riff on that. You know, we're like human dynamic sound libraries. We could do anything you want. Sometimes I'll be given a sound effect where it's like, hey, this one sound effect is perfect, but we need like 20 more of them. They don't exist in the library. So as a Foley team, we can listen to it and craft it and try to come up with 20 more. We are essentially potentially like sonic repeaters. You know, we're impressionists, so we could listen to it and be like, oh, okay. So that's the forensic recording of an AR-15. Okay, why don't we try creating something out of all these random spare parts that sounds closer to the real thing, but also has a performance bent to it. So that's where the division of labor is. It's all collaborative.
Very cool. Thank you. Joe Carter was wondering, what kind of microphones do you like to use?
That's a great question. You know, traditionally Foley artists have been very big fans of the Sennheiser 416. It's like the desert island microphone for a lot of people. I personally spent the first bit of my career using the 416. Since then, you know, I've run the gamut. I've tried everything. I've used Shep CMIT 5Us. I've used Neumann KMR81 Eyes, which was actually for the longest time my favorite microphone. And currently, I'm a big fan of the Sennheiser, the MKH 800, which is a bummer they discontinued that mic, but it has variable polar patterns. It has the right pads in the right places. And it's really cool because that way, if we're doing Foley and we need the sound to be really tight and on axis, I can click it over to HyperCard. I can click it over to Omni if we need something that's a little bit more wide expressive. Like let's say I'm doing a sound that, let's say I'm doing a rolling sound and the actual prop is really wide. So maybe if we want to be able to back the mic up and capture more of it, we can click it over to Cardioid or Omni and get the bigger sense of it. I will say that Foley's interesting because I think there was always debate of like, well, do you use a shotgun mic because you want to perfectly match the EQ and noise response of what was on set, or do we want to use you know, like a Neumann 87, you know what I mean, like a U87, which is in itself like a very beautiful microphone, right? The truth of the matter is, when it comes to the final product, we're all trying to achieve that abstract goal of creating sounds that work inside the world of the film, aesthetically, sonically, and what have you. And to that end, to achieve that goal, microphone choice doesn't matter nearly as much as prop selection and good Foley recording, right? So that being said, if we had to go back in time and I was forced to record Foley on a 416 on like on mag, you know, or not mag, excuse me, on like, I don't know, like 1/2-inch tape, like we'll just adapt and make do with what we have, you know, and try our best to create a sound that tells a story. But that being said, my current love affair is with the Sennheiser.
Awesome. Thank you. There's a comment from somebody in the chat that says, Walter Merck has said, images and sounds are linked together in a dance. And like some kinds of dance, they do not always have to be clasping each other around the waist. They can go off and dance on their own. You've discussed the connection between your music training and Foley, but do you also think of doing Foley as dancing with a film or game in the way that Merck describes?
Yes, absolutely. That's such a great quote. And something that occurred to me when I was studying undergrad, especially when I was trying to deal with this existential crisis between classical music and filmmaking. I spent a lot of time with my with one of my professors who was in the comparative literature department. So obviously, you know, I don't know when's the last time anyone took undergraduate comparative literature, but it's basically taking two elements that can be from totally different media and trying to find that DNA between the two to make a point about something or what have you. Sorry, it's a very rudimentary understanding of what that field of study is. But when it came time for me to examine my career and examine these two things that I loved so much, filmmaking and music, it occurred to me that they had to have shared a DNA for me to love them so much. And so to that end, after a lot of thought, especially after a lot of filmmaking, I realized that what I love the most about being in the cinematography department or being a camera operator or being a boom operator is the dance. I like the notion that we are kind of moving in sync with what we see. And when it comes to music, I love the kinetic energy of music. I love these moments where you're playing something very fast or something very beautiful, and you've kind of transcended your discomfort, right? You've like transcended these awkward frets on the guitar or this like tough note that's coming up through your passaggio, and you're able to create something that is beautiful and it moves, notes that flutter. And so when it came time for me to try to find that shared DNA between film and music, I realized it wasn't the kinetic energy, it wasn't the dance of the film, it was in the dance of the notes and of sound moving inside of my body as a vocalist. So Foley is so much of Foley is dancing, but I'm an awful dancer. That being said, I just have to be able to convince you sonically that I'm a good dancer. So when it came time to do a job like Fosse Verdon, I'm not Bob Fosse, but through really hard work, me and Les were able to convince people that what you're hearing was very masterfully performed footsteps. When they were masterfully performed footsteps. So, we're not perfectly dancing in sync to Bob Fosse, you know what I mean? Like we're saying, it's a slide, step, 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 slide. And so on one hand, it was very amazing to try to recreate, some of these beautiful performances, but and to do so in our own way. But I love that connection between dancing and film. I love the connection between physical movement and kinetic energy, and seeing that shared DNA, and then being able to live that shared DNA in the Foley stage.
When thinking about Walter Merck, another thing that comes to mind is all the innovations that he did in terms of sound worldizing. Do you know what I mean when you mean that? So my question for you is, are there times when the Foley studio is not really enough to worldize the sound? Do you have to go on location to a different place, or do you use convolution reverbs to help you in that pursuit?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. So sorry, 1 second. I got so excited. So when it comes to worldizing Foley, yeah, one of the big issues that, like, going from the 1990s into the 2000s, and I'm saying this from a historical perspective because obviously, I'm a millennial. I was born in 91. A lot of Foley for the longest time was performed close mic'd in an attempt to create enough signal to overcome the noise inherent in analog recordings, right? I was often recorded close mic'd and performed with as much gusto as possible. And when the technology changed, our perception of what was sonically possible changed too. So when it came to creating Foley in a digital era where people expect things to sound really good and as close to mix as possible, one of the solutions that was very much beloved in the New York area was going on location to shoot the Foley. And by location, I don't even necessarily mean the filming location. By location, I mean going to a sonically similar environment, and instead of trusting Altiverb to create the right reverb, we would set up a close mic and a room mic in the actual location and perform footsteps and walk them in perspective and in sync. So the innovators of that format really are, there are two people. One is, or two teams. One's Andy Malcolm in Canada, and he and his teams wanted to transcend and move away from the isolated sound booth Foley and record things with perspective and get things to sound like they actually move around in space. And also the work of Ryan Collison and Jay Peck over at Sound One in New York, also in the late 90s, early 2000s, where they started building these quick, cute little mobile Pro Tools rigs. So that way you get all the benefits of field recording, but you also get the benefit of having an actual performer on site performing stuff perfectly in sync. And so one of the things we did at Alchemy was we created two Foley stages. One Foley stage was a classical Foley stage like this one, where there's tons of absorption and diffusion, and sounds are relatively dead in here. And then we also had a Foley stage where we stripped all of the insulation off of it, so it was very live sounding. That way, when you have a U87 in the back of the room capturing, room ambience, you actually get to hear the sound bounce in the room, which meant that if a character walked, occlusion, right, like walks behind a door, we're able to actually perform it that way. And so you got all these awesome benefits, and the clients loved it. You know what I mean? Like, they loved it because for once the footsteps didn't just sound like in this dead room, and it actually felt like the feet were moving all around you. At the height of it, we were able to play back scenes with no dialogue and no sound effects, and only the Foley, and get a sense not just of like the perspective actually working, but on top of that, also getting the performance to work. Watching scenes where there's no dialogue, but you can tell who's kind of got the ball in the scene and who's hurt, who's got the pain, which is like a very, like, it's Bob Fosseism, right? But like, being able to play back scenes without any sound effects, without any plugins, and have it feel so dynamically perfect, that was kind of the benefit of location Foley. However, obviously I now work in linear or non-linear media, where all of the Foley systems are using convolution reverbs in the box in live real-time space, right? So the footsteps I'm creating in here have to work in potentially dozens of different rooms. So we can't like bake in the exact reverb that we need. And so the result is that a lot of the Foley that I've performed recently, we have either used outboard gear to add reverb to all of it to give it that sense of perspective that I used to get working with Les and Ryan out there at Alchemy, or conversely, the desire is for there to be no room sound, for it to be absolutely as transparent and non-reflective as possible, because the procedural system will figure out what the room's early reflection time is and then produce the right reverb to lay on top of it. So it all depends on your goals. But location Foley I always enjoyed because of like my background in classical music. Like, sorry, I'm like so pretentious, but like opera singers, when they go to an opera house, they spend a lot of their rehearsals learning how to like project into the room and achieve resonance with these beautiful, beautiful spaces. So that way they could sing without blowing out their lungs and still sing louder than an orchestra, right? And so as a Foley artist, whenever I do Foley on location in the right environment, it actually allows me to play the room. No different than an electric guitarist doesn't just play the guitar, they play the amp, right? So that's one of the big performance benefits of recording Foley on location. And often when I'm talking to film students who might not have access to a Foley stage, I tell them to embrace recording on location. Embrace the fact that you can bring an iPad with the film loaded and actually see the footstep performance. And even if you don't have the capacity to record it perfectly in sync, still be able to reference that and then create footsteps and props and clothing sounds in that environment. It will actually probably sound better than just recording it in a closet. Speaking of which, I know somebody brought up during our preparation talking about shooting Foley during COVID. But do anyone else have any questions regarding Foley on location?
We have another question that came in that's not about location, but I don't see any additional ones about that. I did have kind of a follow-up, and then Sound has sent me some questions which I will ask after this. But while we're on the topic of moving from linear media like film to non-linear media like video games, I'm wondering if you could help the audience by kind of letting people know, maybe for other Foley artists that are out there that are thinking about transitioning towards non-linear media like games, like what kinds of stuff should they be learning about, and what are the challenges that they're going to face when they move into that medium?
Yeah, it's really tough. So luckily for people who are making this very strong, concerned effort to move more into game sound, I think there's a lot of benefit to, film sound is so dogmatic in its practices and principles, and it's a fixed system, right? Like film sound, if we can see film sound itself as a fixed system, even within games, right? Look at Metal Gear Solid, where you have these like 3-hour cutscenes that are practically films, but they themselves are, so film itself is a fixed system. So transitioning game audio, you have to kind of think of ways to break out of that fixed system, right? So that being said, something I tell aspiring game audio people to do is like learn scripting, learn at least a little bit of computer science. I had the benefit of having taken Python and Max MSP courses while I was at music technology at Steinhardt. And, you know, in a really weird way, I think I'm one of the very few Foley artists out there who is like a dyed in the wool, highly trained Foley artist who's like exclusively been, you know, in that field and in that social scene and in that training, to also have some knowledge of WISE middleware and procedural audio systems. So I guess, you know, something that I'll bring up in terms of like transitioning as a Foley artist specifically, it's that you have to start thinking of creating sounds in systemic ways. You have to start breaking down, you know, how is it that I walk? You know, what are the mechanics of a footstep? Because in film, we just have to get it to sound right once, right? Like we just have to perform the sound properly, so that way when the audience plays it back, and they'll play it back the exact same way every time, that it works. However, in game environments and in virtual environments, you're going to have to create such a wide variety of sounds that have to work in so many different places and in different ways with different characters, that you have to kind of like walk back a little bit and break down some of the forensics as to what we do, right? A lot of what I do is operating like a Rosetta Stone between classical cinema Foley techniques with modern system designs. I'm sorry, that's a kind of a vague answer. I really wish I could give you a more specific one, but I will say that, you know, Foley for games is incredibly taxing. You know, I used to think that one of the hardest projects I worked on when I was younger was a documentary about flag football, which you would think shouldn't be such a hard thing to create Foley for. But in that documentary, I had to shoot footsteps for these super wide shots covering every single person on screen, because that was what the director wanted. They wanted to be able to have footsteps for every single person in a football team, in 2 football teams. And even though it was flag football, not tackle football, it was exhausting. It was probably the most amount of footsteps I've ever shot on any one project. That being said, when you look at a game, that flag football documentary pales in comparison, because now I have to create footsteps for entire cities of people, for situations that I might not know about. You know, how do I create something that is curated enough that it conveys the character and the performance of what's happening without putting such a curatorial or specific spin on it, that it can be used in as many different ways as possible. So learning to think of Foley in that sense is the big jumping off point. And I'll be completely honest with you, I'm still in the process of doing that, you know? So I think most of the time you talk to a Foley artist about the difference between games and film, they'll more than likely tell you that it's pretty much the same, except at the end of the session, you then have to create footsteps for every possible surface, every possible shoe, and every possible prop. And I'll go on and add on top of that then you have to start thinking about the bigger ideas. You know, how do I create footsteps that work for small characters and large characters? How do I create footsteps that can be for antagonists and protagonists at the same time?
Excellent. Thank you so much. We had another question from Sound Suresh. This is more of a general question about sound mix in film. And Sound was asking, had mentioned that in animated films, sound effects are more important than in a regular movie. I guess that they perceive the sound effects are louder in animated films than regular movies. They were kind of wondering why. I don't know if you have an answer to that.
I kind of do, because first of all, most animated films are themselves impressionist, right? They are not, you know, the last time I remember a film that was trying so hard to look so real was like Final Fantasy Spirits Within. And that was like, I think 2000. And in that film, they were trying so hard to present digital humans that were photorealistic. Like, wow, look at what we can do. We can make photorealistic humans. However, in that film, they're doing the most outrageous things. They're like running around a post-apocalyptic world, shooting at giant spirit alien creatures with laser guns and wearing armor that frankly on a real human would be exhausting to wear. And so as much as there is kind of this when it comes to animation, everything is bespoke, everything is created in a virtual environment, right? So animation, if anything, is a perfect example as to why animation itself, you just watch any documentary about Chuck Jones and Bugs Bunny, and how they're cheating extra frames, or they're trying to do these very funny impressionistic things and give this bunny the curvaceous walk of a gorgeous woman, or trying to trying to give these animals all this humanistic expression. So when it comes time to compare animation to traditional live action film, I actually think that very much, even in the medium itself, even without sound, there's already exaggeration, right? So I wouldn't say that sound effects are more important in animation. I'd say that because that world has no production sound, that you have to create something for it, right? But on the other hand, in live action film, there's often already like a layer of background sound that's recorded on set. The irony being that production sound mixers on set are tasked with recording dialogue as cleanly as possible. I think when a production sound mixer I know is happy, it's because the lavaliers are crystal clear. You don't hear the jackhammering in the back. You don't hear the grips setting up for the next shot. And it almost sounds like each person is in a perfect black hole, yet there's still perspective that works with the camera, right? And so to that end, I'd actually say that whether or not there's an importance based on the media, I would say that I don't necessarily agree with that. I'd actually think that sound, no matter what medium you're working in, is highly important, and that they're always being curated. The difference really is the fact that in live action film, there's such a plethora of different economic modalities that you end up with films where they can't get sound design because they can't afford it. So they have to rely on what was recorded on production. Or you have directors who care so much about reality that they don't want post-production to touch anything. And so in those instances, sound is just as important. It's just that the aesthetic of what we're used to and expecting sounds different than in an animation where everything is curated, everything has to be generated.
Fantastic. Thank you. Dan Mortensen was wondering about your studio and about the size of the studio. He asks, how much of your studio are we seeing behind you?
Okay, so I'm just going to see how much USB slack I have on this webcam, but there's our studio, there's the rest of our studio, there's our entrance and what have you. And the other extreme end, we have even more prop storage over to the right of me. This Foley stage is roughly, I want to say, I'm trying to remember how many square feet it was. It's pretty large, actually. It's roughly 900 square feet. I'm trying to remember exactly the details. But yeah, it's pretty decently sized. I wouldn't say it's one of those massive, I don't think it's the same as archive stage at Skywalker, which is 1,200 square feet, or C5 Sound in New Jersey, which is something crazy 1,600 square feet. But for what we do in games where we don't need as much air in terms of getting a mic all the way back because everything is procedurally positioned in a virtual space, this is a perfect size because it means we can get microphones far enough back that we can capture the entire sound field of what we're creating, but we don't have so much residual room noise and room reflection that it negatively affects the bounce. So almost to the point where when this room was first constructed, they were worried it was too dead. So they actually put flutter free on some of the walls here to try to give it an extra transient or two. To which case, sometimes we've just considered ripping it down, because when they do give us the opportunity to create more room sound, we're not sound, I guess it's kind of a improper use of words. When they want us to create something that's more dynamic with the room, we use an Eventide harmonizer, we dial in a reverb and we play with it until we get it to sound right. So we are still given that opportunity a lot of times.
Cool. Well, I think I am out of questions from the chat, unless anybody has any more questions for Joanna. Let's wait a little bit, see if some more people chime in.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm like a mile a minute person, like spent the last 12 years in New York, and uh I'm always thinking so much about everything all at once. So it's like I always have an anecdote ready to go. Um but yeah, I mean, this is an amazing, if that's it, this was like an amazing opportunity. Oh, props. What about props? We have so many props.
Can you show us some?
Oh yeah, heck yeah. Oh yes. Let's talk about some props. As promised, I can demo some stuff. So give me one section. Oh yeah, right here. Something that a lot of people talk about, expectation versus reality, right? Something that happens quite a bit in the world of cinema and in the world of gaming is we're always expected to do tons and tons of gore sound effects, and we have to make them pretty bespoke, So let me switch to low suppression. There we go. Okay, so we have a grocery budget at the Foley stage. On pretty much every project we load up, and we get tons, we go over to Vaughn's and we buy tons and tons of stuff. So one of my favorite props is just simply put some celery, right? It's a classic Foley gag. When it comes to tendons and things like that, we can like really get in there and get that like creak just from this little thing. Let's say I'm trying to stretch my back, and wait, hold up, I gotta add something to that. But
These need to be real close to the mic.
real close to the mic. Yeah, it's funny, I'm using an RE20, so it's probably it's got its own, what do you call it, gating. Give me one second, let me see if I can actually open up the mic all the way open, so that way let's see.
Maybe turn original sound on.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if that's oh, here we go. Okay, enable these options when original sound is on. Okay, cool. Let's see. Okay, I got that going. Let's see if I can get this to go here. Okay, I got the microphone selected. Okay, well, hopefully this works. If it doesn't, then I could always record it, isolate it on my own later, and send it to everybody. But actually, I got an idea. There's a way to do this to trick the gate without necessarily needing to restart my Zoom and interrupt this beautiful moment. But one of my favorite things is celery, but I also really love dry pasta because, let's say I've had a long day and I'm just like, oh, my back. I'm able to just do it with some very simple things. Hope, did that work? Did
that came through good?
That came through really good. Okay, glad.
That was awesome.
It's funny because I have to, like, when I've had to do these, I've had to kind of like sneak dialogue in to trick the noise suppression, and so it's just like, oh, my arm. And just go ahead and do it and sing over it while we go for it. But yeah, we have tons of props here. We have a lot of things that are expendable, like obviously the celery and the lasagna I just used. So everyone's like, oh, use lasagna? It's not too wet and slimy. I'm like, no, you gotta use lasagna that hasn't been cooked yet, silly. These things are worth their weight in gold. And during the supply chain issues all throughout the pandemic, we actually had multiple times where we've gone to the grocery store and there was not a single box of lasagna left, not a single box of manicotti left. That's another type of pasta shell. It's really big. It kind of looks like a big piece of penne. And they we recently went over there and we found out, hey, they restocked it, and we took everything we could get our hands on. So while everyone else was trying to get toilet paper, I was trying to get lasagna. That's another question that was asked earlier, but I didn't get a chance to talk about, which is that, shooting Foley at home during the worst parts of the lockdown. Are there a lot of Foley? I know in the New York area there's 3 within like 30 miles. But during the lockdown, I converted one of my walk-in closets into an isolated Foley booth with like a monitor, and it was like a sweat factory because I had to sneak in there during from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. every evening to record rustle and hand pats and cloth movement stuff because it was so loud during the day when I was working from home that I just couldn't get my neighbors to quiet down enough. And it wasn't on me to tell everyone else working from home to quiet down for my sake. So I just shifted my hours. But the other big revelation I had during work from home was that location Foley is already a thing. So when it came time for me to shoot certain sound effects at home, I actually embraced the fact that I was working from home. I embraced the fact that I was living in a loft and could put a microphone all the way up at the top on the second floor. And when I do hand claps, it sounds like it's actually traveling through a room. And so shooting Foley during COVID was very strange. Eventually we figured out, obviously we figured out ways to keep everyone safe, alternate entrances for the Foley artist and the Foley mixer, splitting up our teams so that we weren't using tandem teams and we're using single operator teams. And so it was a very strange experience. And honestly, I'm still processing it. We're still in it to a degree. But that's, yeah, hopefully that'll answer that COVID question. What is your great sound discovery with a prop? That's really interesting. How do we define a great sound discovery? What's the one thing that was oh my gosh, that works? Let's think about this. I got it. So we have to do so much rope creaking sounds over the course of a day. You'd be surprised. There's so much creaking leather. There's so much what do you call it? There's so many moments where you need this abstract idea of something tightening. So even if somebody's being strangled in a movie, if you listen carefully, there's almost always the tightening of leather. Something about that conveys this choking feeling. And so one of my favorite sound discoveries was that I have this really old pistol holster, and it creaks perfectly, and I put it in everything. It's like my Wilhelm scream prop. So if I'm doing characters that are on a tightrope walking, I'll add the creak in with this holster. If I have characters that are being strangled, which surprisingly happens a lot, I throw that in there too. And if I have a character who's wearing a gun belt that's particularly tight, let's say someone's a little bit on the heavier side and they're just bursting at the seams, yet again, it's that same dang thing. And I honestly am worried about the day when somebody's going to call me out on it, because they're going to start hearing it now. But that's probably one of my favorite sound discoveries. I think the second favorite one I had was that, when it comes to snow footsteps, people almost always go for sand and have a good one, Mike. They almost always go for sand, and they also go for cornstarch in a pillowcase, or even holding the cornstarch in their hands. Something I figured out was that if you take sound blankets and you put them over a gravel pit, you can actually convincingly create a lot of good creaks and cracks and moans of snow. So and that was totally by happenstance. I was trying to cover up a gravel pit because we were going to do some glass breaking sounds, and I wanted to protect our dirt pits. And so I threw it down, and as I walked over it, I stopped and I was like, whoa, that sounds really convincing. And I brought Les in. I was like, check this out. Doesn't this sound like snow? And I started walking on it, and he was like, oh my gosh, it does sound like snow. And so from that point forward, the cornstarch budget went down by half. We were like, oh, this is great. You just throw a sound blanket on top of it. Yeah, these are dirt pits behind me. We have several different pits. 1 second. Let me see if I can get a better angle. Big filing cabinet. We had to do some big rotation sounds earlier. But yeah, so this is our Foley stage. We have 3 different wood pits. We have packed dirt, we have dense dirt, we have brick. If you look underneath that microphone, that's brick. We have a massive concrete pit, we have sand, we have gravel, and we have this lovely, I don't know if you can see it right now, but we have this lovely broken glass pit that we use for glass traversal. Yet again, surprising. It happens a lot in media. And yeah, and some of these pits are super deep. Our wood pits, one of them is so deep that I actually have to put my arms up to get out of it. We had to go down there to fix some of the foundation of it, and it was actually kind of scary. But yeah, I'm really lucky. If we ever need to add pits, we have permission to go ahead and bring a contractor in and cut new pits out of our massive concrete pit. So it's been a really good time. I'm really happy working here. And like I said, I don't represent Sony, but I am more than happy to be flattering about my experiences as a Foley artist here.
Nice. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I think we should go ahead and conclude. Thank you so much, Joanna. That was awesome.
Of course. Happy to be here and happy to present it.
So one of the things about these meetings is that we're all here and it's easy for us to be comfortable. So we can go to an open discussion for a while if you want to. And what has been really neat is sometimes people have had problems with audio and they can't figure something out and they've asked it and somebody else had some knowledge who could help them with that. So if you have that, go ahead and say it. Otherwise, what do you want to talk about? What have you done lately that's cool, Steve?
I'm gonna have to take off.
Oh, well, that's not
But
fun.
it's not fun at all. I just didn't want to, leave without saying goodbye. An excellent meeting. Congrats to all and have a great conversation. Talk to you.
All right, see ya.
Bye.
So anybody been having something cool lately that you've been involved in? You professors should definitely have something that's been interesting. What have you enjoyed sharing with your classes lately?
I want to talk about we here in I live in a small city called Aguascalientes, and we don't have too much equipment or money, but here talking to Joanna about the Foley in location is what we do in our work in some of the students, film students. We have a lot of location Foley, or sometimes in the same classroom we keep quiet and record some of the things with our Zooms or Tascam recorders. We hope we later can have a Foley studio like yours.
You said you lived in Las Caliente. Is that the heat?
Aguascalientes, hot waters.
Oh, hot waters. Okay.
That's the name of the city.
Is there a hot spring or something?
Yes, we used to have 3 hot springs, but it's a city in the center of the country, and we are more with these heats. We are changing the weather like a desert, and there are now we just have 1 hot spring.
Well, this is really exciting for me to be in this situation where there's people from all over the world talking to us and able to describe your situation. I'm not quite sure what to ask, but you're making film soundtracks, and do you make the film also, or is it divided up by job? Some people make the film and some do the audio.
We have in the school a program where all the students do everything, but every semester the kids have projects, short films, and they are changing roles. So sometimes some make sound, sometimes some camera, and sometimes some direct or produce.
What age range are the kids?
Yes.
How old are they?
They are from university.
Okay.
18.
Great. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll jump in. My students, at University of Washington is more of a theory-based kind of program, cinema studies, but I feel like the students are really craving hands-on stuff. So I've been trying to I brought in a bunch of synthesizers into the classroom, and we did, had some, I don't know if you know the program Reason, kind of a software emulator, and that was fun. So they were just messing around. They're not music students, and we had a sci-fi film going and trying to do kind of real-time sci-fi sounds, compositions. But Foley is something I think a lot of them is really capturing their imagination now that we're kind of starting to talk more about, like, well, we talked about King Kong, but that, like, Apocalypse Now, and they're starting to think about sound musically, as kind of like the intersection between the two and how they overlap. So so I didn't see any of them show up tonight. I was hoping that some of them would tune in. but it's, I think coming out of COVID too, where everyone's been isolated, and especially students, just like everything's online, and now they're coming back into the classroom, and for some of them it's the first time they've done that since like high school, even, if they're a freshman or a sophomore. So I feel like, yeah, they're really wanting something tangible, and I can sit there and I can talk and read my notes, and it's like, whatever. It's kind of, I mean, it's an interesting history, but it's, it's still me talking. So I think, yeah, I'd love to find some way to incorporate hands-on stuff, even though we're not set up for it at the university. Find a spot, some kind of stage to do this kind of work. And even if it's, just rudimentary, and kind of like have fun with it, So anyway, I just wanted to share that there's kind of like this drive among them to really get to dive into it, and to, yeah, hands-on kind of tangible experience.
And maybe this is a Joanna question, but how primitive could John's class, how primitive equipment wise could they be and do something useful and interesting?
Good question.
Really good question. I'd say that, like, honestly, in the very beginning, like, the very beginning notions of creating sound effects to sync with picture, the technology doesn't need to be like, you don't need like the best microphones, or like, you don't even, I'd argue that maybe 48 kilohertz 24-bit should be the standard, if not only to, 16-bit has its own, obviously its own noise floor, and it's its own like preferred range of volume. But honestly, I think the magic of creating a sound in sync to a picture and then playing it back, and then having your students each take a turn at like the same sound, and having them all interpret it differently, I think that alone is enough of an experience, no matter how primitive the equipment is and how primitive the playback is often enough to just get someone to get a sense of like what I'm addicted to as a Foley artist. So I'd say, if I've done funnily enough, I've actually done Foley on phones. I've done Foley on like MacBook Pro, like webcam microphones. Luckily the film in question had a lot of like practical microphone work. Like a lot of it was shot on a phone, a lot of it was shot on a MacBook, so we're able to get away with it. But I'd say just maybe even the simple act of doing it could be compelling enough that you don't necessarily need a very extensive system. So that being said, you just need something that can allow you to rapidly record something to a moving image and then play it back against a moving image. And I don't know how deep into Reaper some of these schools are getting, but it's increasingly becoming a very powerful tool in the game audio world, to the point where, I'll be honest, I'm exhausted trying to keep up with like what Pro Tools keeps renaming itself to. You know what I mean? Now I have to worry about Pro Tools Flex or Pro Tools Studio, or I really miss the good old days when it was just like you have LE, normal, and HD, and like that was it. But you don't need a system that powerful. So honestly, anything that lets you have a video track and an audio track, even if it's recording something wild, like having like a Zoom recorder recording everyone doing it wild, and then syncing it later in between classes and then doing the playback, that's another way of doing it, so you don't have to be completely held down by the constraints of software.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for that. And I like the idea too of like Reaper, something a little more, I mean, we're using Audacity a little bit too, but yeah, just because it's so basic. But yeah, Reaper, you could have the the image in there, the film in there too, and not have to deal with all the Pro Tools confusion. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
And Joanna, you mentioned that before a session, I guess, or before a project, you go to the grocery store and stock up on stuff. And the celery and the pasta was mind blowing seeing that. What other kinds of things do you get when you go to the grocery store?
That's a really good question. If dry ice, and we know we might have to do some like thunder recordings or any sort of like really magical zizzing and popping, sometimes we'll go and get dry ice. Other things we'll get for we call them expendables, right? And so other expendables we've gone to the grocery store to get. Uh, I also like to get like cantaloupe, and if I can get myself to like I don't know if they have them up there, but like a ranch 99, and go into some more exotic fruits that people might not have heard yet, like what's a good example of that, like jackfruit, for example. It's only recently started blowing up in popularity. Like, my goodness, here's this weird fruit that tastes like bubble gum, and if you cook it right, you can trick people into thinking it's pulled pork. Like, what a weird fruit. It sounds weird too. You have to get it like the perfect ripeness, but it's weird and stringy and rippy. And we had a very unripe one. It barely made sound, but the more riper ones sound great.
How are you triggering it to make a sound?
I pre-cut it, and then in sync to picture, I'll rip it apart. So we had to do a gore sound effects library recently for sound designers to just generally use as part of like utility kit. And we basically went to Asian supermarket, and we didn't just get for the standard stuff like celery, lasagna, and grapefruit. Grapefruit's huge. I love grapefruit. I've used grapefruit for tons of stuff because it's just big citrusy membranes, and you can do the sound of people's skins getting ripped off by peeling fruit off the meat, stuff like that. But in addition to that, yeah, the jackfruit and the dragon fruit, and then the other one's lychees. Like, if you can get the lychee with the shell still on, you can get some really interesting stuff out of that. Like, so I had to do the sound of, it's so morbid. I had to do the sound of someone's eye getting like taken out. The film, like last year, it was like a zombie movie, and I literally was like, okay, let's try some stuff out. So I used a lychee, and I peeled the outside of it. I peeled a little bit of the outside so it saw the cavity, and I like slurped it, and it was gross and horrifying and funny. Other things we've tried is I've purchased rice before to mimic sand. We were doing some sand recordings, and we wanted bigger particulates, and so it's just like, what if we just tried pouring rice instead? Old school.
When you're doing this, are you recording it as you manipulate it? So you pour the rice, or you shred the dragon fruit or whatever, and you smash things, and you record it, and then you listen to the sound and say, yeah, that's what I wanted.
It depends. I trust my Foley mixer, so he's like sitting behind the console, and like he's instructing me, making sure the mic's not too far, too close. He's probably doing some pitch shifting sometimes. My current Foley mixer's name is Blake Collins. He's an amazing Foley mixer. But we do it all at once. So I'll set it up. He'll beep me in. You know what I mean? I'll hear the 3 cue beeps, and then I'm in record. In some of these situations where sometimes I've had to Foley concept art, like we don't even have a final animation or product. We just have the idea of the character and what they wear and what shoes they wear, and we have to create interesting sounds for them. So in those situations, I'm trusting Blake that he's capturing a good sound, and our signal path is super clean. So usually we're just using like Millennia preamps, and like I said, the Sennheiser 800, which is like a classical mic, right? We also use like we're using an Avid HDIO at 96 kilohertz, 24-bit, so we have that extra octave to work with if we have a pitch shift. And then any of our outboard, we're using like Eventide harmonizers, and some in the box stuff like low air, and what's the other piece of equipment we use? Yeah, we have all sorts of signal processing that's happening on input going into Pro Tools. So I do trust his ear, and definitely there are times where we sit back down to edit the sounds we've recorded and just give it one more pass, and I'm like, ooh, that actually didn't work out the way I wanted to. Sometimes we'll go reshoot sounds. Often I'll do I'll put on a shoe and I perform a character, and if I'm watching it after we've shot it and editing in sync, realizing like I didn't get that shuffle right. Like the character comes to a stop and is a little cocky, you know, like I have to get that like smarminess in his feet. Sometimes there'll be stuff like that. Other times I'll flat out accidentally miss a footstep here and there and I can't just edit to fix it. Those are the times where we have to go back and reshoot stuff. But yeah, I do trust that he's recording it very cleanly. And honestly, my signal path right now is as neutral as it's ever been. Back in the day in the 81 or the Neumann 81 or the 416, there's so much excessive high frequency boost on it that sounds are even brighter, more sheeny. You know, sometimes it's to great advantage. Like if we have to do mouth goose sounds, you know, sometimes I've had to just do the sound of like mouth chewing. Using a mic like a 416 is like actually better at that because it pushes the right frequencies. We have to do less with it in the mix. And so yeah, that's pretty much how we operate. We do it all at once, and I trust my mixer that it sounds the way we want it to sound. And it's about giving authorship to him too. You know, like I said, I really don't like the narrative that the Foley artist is purely the one in charge of how things end up sounding or playing out. I much rather think of it as a collaborative process with two other people in the room at the very least. In which case,
could you talk about that a little bit? Because that's really interesting. You are out there on the floor making the noise, and somebody else is capturing it and putting it into the recording media. And what's the third person doing?
Oh, the editor, you know, or the assistant Foley artist, or whoever else is our third. But almost always it's the editor. So obviously, like I had mentioned before, you know, someone has to cue and then edit, but the Foley editor also has a curatorial responsibility. You know, they're often the ones who are looking at notes from directors and cross-referencing and making sure that the team translated it. And they are not purely technical craftspeople. Like one of my favorite editors, Laura Heinzinger, she genuinely deeply cares about sound. And so for her, the task of Foley editorial is not purely pre-programming every sound effect that we have to hit and letting us know, hey, fits up here, fits up here, fits up here. It isn't just watching down the footage and collecting media and building Pro Tool sessions. It isn't just editing what we give her in sync. It's also performing that polish, doing basic clip gain functions and some EQ and corrective work to preserve the Foley. But most importantly, a Foley editor, like the Foley mixer, will have an opinion as to what sounds correct. And so what keeps me humble and what keeps me in check is the fact that, you know, myself, the Foley mixer, and the Foley editor all have ears on a project, and they are equally creatively involved, because if we mess up, let's say that I totally use the wrong shoe or the wrong floor surface, or if the performance just doesn't quite say what it needs to say, like if a character is really upset and they're walking away and they're scorned, that sounds much different than somebody who's walking away at peace with themselves. And so if the Foley editor detects that the performance isn't translating, or that we misinterpreted the performance, he or she is the last line of defense to call the Foley stage and say, hey, you guys have to reshoot this sound effect right now. And so that's why I think of it as a collaborative process. And that's why I fight really hard to let go of purely having the ownership fall on my shoulders. You know, I think a lot of times it's easy for us to you know, list off a lot of great sound designers and folks, but I do believe that support staff are also artists and have and deserve a place in having their artistic opinions represented.
And you would think that you have to be able to make mistakes in order to achieve hit it out of the ballpark too. You're not, if you don't take a risk, you're not gonna hit it.
100%. I'd say that, like, I have messed up more Foley cues than I've achieved. Like every good Foley I've ever performed took 2 or 3 like stabs at it to get it right. Sorry, such aggressive language. It took at least 2 or 3 additional takes to get it right, you know? So very rarely does the fusion of luck and performance and knowledge result in the first take being the perfect take. And then other times I try not to be so precious. Like sometimes I'll do a sound and I think it sounded awesome, and then I hear back from either the mixer or editorial that like you could have done better, or like it needs more of this or it needs more of that. It's not on me to argue with them that their curatorial sense is wrong. it's on me as the artist to be flexible and then try a new approach or a different prop or a different miking. And it's humbling to say the least, but it's how we grow. And honestly, this is why I like working here on a Foley stage than out there like on stage doing like live sound. I've done front of house a few times in my life. I am scared like shitless by it. Like it is so scary to me. Even if it's like someone's bar mitzvah to like like a live music venue with big speakers, like I am always freaked out when I have to get behind the console because it's like there's no second takes. You get it right, you know? And you
And
can
everybody in the room knows who screwed up when there's a problem.
yeah, 100%. And so yeah, it's humbling, and that's why I appreciate working in a recording environment because it's like I'm given the opportunity to screw up and try again, and that's not afforded to like half of our workforce as sound people, right? Like whether you're a musician or a front of house mixer. So I take that for what it is, and I hope it doesn't mess with my ego to the point where I believe that like the first take is like a Mona Lisa that is like perfect. Another revision, you know. So
If
yeah.
you did, you'd need to get a new job.
Yeah, seriously.
Probably. That wouldn't go over very well, I wouldn't think.
Yeah.
What does your assistant do? What does the assistant artist do?
Right now we don't have one, unfortunately, but back when I was working in New York, the assistant Foley artist, well, it depends. There's so many different ways to cut it, but the way we always looked at it was you have someone who's like a Foley apprentice, so maybe somebody who sits in on sessions and helps get props and helps clean up, you know, and their job is to observe and to grow. And when we have opportunities, whether it's you know, doing background footstep passes where you just need to create a ton of footsteps really quickly, and I'm sorry, excuse me, and maybe the stakes aren't as high when it comes to nailing sync or, you know, places with a lot of safety nets. That's when we throw the Foley apprentice on there and try to get them some practice and some time behind the microphone. But assistant Foley artists, they're really there to learn. You know, I was an assistant Foley artist, or I was a Foley apprentice, and then I became an assistant Foley artist, and then I became like just a flat out Foley artist, and now I'm a senior Foley artist. So like I've been through the whole ladder. Back in the day in the 90s and even earlier, you know, sometimes there wasn't a discrepancy between who was considered the older veteran and who was considered the young acolyte. But there was always a sense of like this oral tradition where if you're the assistant Foley artist or the second or whatever the leadership dynamic is, you're there to gain as much knowledge as possible and to support the Foley production. So other times where I've been the assistant, a lot of that entails, you know, at its peak, being a good assistant Foley artist is like taking meticulous notes about what was used to create a sound in case it needs to be revisited. At the same time, you know, when it comes to, you know, prop fetching, something I used to love doing as an assistant was, you know, Les would say, hey, can you get me this one prop from the bin? I'm like, yeah, sure. So I'd get the prop for him, and then quietly I would grab maybe a backup prop, like a prop that like maybe might work, that maybe my decision of what maybe would work, and I'd always have that as a backup behind my back. So I'd give him the prop he was looking for, and if it still wasn't quite working, I'd very gently be like, hey, can we try this instead? You know, so always being able to provide a solution, right? Always being able to be there to support the artists, but also to try not have an ego about it, you know, because we'll let the lead Foleyers have an ego about it. You know, the Foley assistant's job is to sit back and be humble and just to learn.
What's the longest take? I was imagining you were going to say the assistant prepares the next thing for when you finish these footsteps.
Oh yeah.
You go over and do that. Is that a thing too?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So something we used to do was if we had a really long day ahead of us, besides returning props, sometimes there would be prop prep. So while, you know, Les is like shooting out footsteps, I'm already gathering all the clothing props or the metal props, and that usually happens if I have like a cue sheet and I could look at the entire prop listing, or if I've like conversely have like seen or edited or cued the movie already and already know what challenges lie ahead, I can start pre-preparing for that. Other times it's prop runs. Like let's say we run out of lasagna on day 2 of the shoot, like assistant Polaris has to hop in a car and go down to the grocery store and like try a bunch of things, maybe hit a few fruit and see to listen which one sounds the best and then bring them over. So they often do have our artistic say in the process. It's just a lot more subtle.
What's the longest sequence that you would expect to do during the course of a day, or you've ever done, or something? Or are they short bursts, or is it long stretches of activity?
It depends. You know, sometimes these movies they'll have like 600 just hand pats. So I'm like, okay, cool, we're in hand pat city. I'll sit down in my most comfortable chair, throw a pair of jeans over my shoulders, and we're just gonna record hand pats for like 4 hours. In
What's a hand pat?
just like literally patting hands,
Oh,
you know, like people giving high fives, scratching their heads, and like, you know, anything that's just super like, not, I don't want to say generic, but anything that just the sound of a hand hitting is
yeah.
enough to convey it. So other times, the very first thing we do, I wish I almost explained this mechanically during the presentation, but one of the first things Foley teams do, or maybe sometimes the last thing they do, but we have to record a generic like cloth sound for the entire film front to back. And that's called like the movement pass in Britain. It's called the cloth pass in LA. It's called a Russell pass in New York. So basically all it is like, just like I'm wearing like a leather jacket, so maybe this is not the best example, but you grab like a pair of jeans or a suit jacket and you just kind of follow where the eye wants to take you, where the dialogue is, and just create this the most casual utilitarian clothing sound that's in sync with what you see, and maybe has some like performance like to it. And you have to do it for everything because they want an entire cloth pass to lay down in case they have to do line replacement, or for like the foreign distribution when they have to redub the whole movie anyways. And so that pass takes forever. I've done cloth passes where it's like for a 3-hour movie, it usually takes about 4 hours to do the cloth pass. And you're just sitting there and record for the entire duration of the project, just like rubbing this suit jacket against your stomach in sync with whoever's talking on screen. That takes a while, but I'm trying to think of like the single longest. Like cloth passes are funny because I try to beat my last record. Like how long can I stay perfectly in sync with no stomach growls and no disturbances and no bleed from outside, no, oh, hold on, I forgot to set the EQ up for cloth, you know, like no disturbances whatsoever. I think I've done 40 minutes nonstop once. But that was like a golden moment. I was like, I got it. I made no stomach noises for 40 minutes. I did not need to take a bathroom break, and I was perfectly in sync, and I could just, not perfectly, but obviously like in sync enough. Yeah.
Is that recording in synced to the action forever then? So whenever they need that sound in that moment, they go to that spot in the original?
So
Okay.
it's like almost like I'd say like the most critical part of Foley is the fact that it's performed in sync, right? So it's like it's not like I'm recording these wild generically and not looking at the
Right.
picture, right? So it's like in those moments, the clothing path is super important because it's what's gonna tie the footsteps and the props together and also tie it with the dialogue. So for example, if a character is walking, stops, leans down to grab a cup from a table, yeah, we'll get the footsteps and we'll get the sound of glass being picked up, but it's the cloth movement as he or she leans down to grab it that like will be missing in the soundtrack. So having that captured adequately, super important, because that yet again is the dance. You know, it's like the visual flow. Your eyes gonna want to follow who's talking. Your eyes gonna want to follow who's closest to screen or doing the most prominent movement. And so a cloth pass is actually really magical because it's not super forensic. It's very flowy and it's very impressionistic, but it is so necessary.
Cool. I haven't noticed. Are there questions here?
I have a quick question because it just kind of came up. Is the Foley mixer dealing with panorama at all in the live session, or is panorama of the sound handled in post, like post session?
You mean like in terms of like stereo panning?
Yeah.
Yeah. So usually we're trying to record a really nice mono point source of sound, especially in video games because nowadays everything's so virtual. So you'd have to record it and then you implement it and you attach it to an emitter, right? The times where Foley mixers I know have been very cautious or careful about panning have been times where we have to do stereo microphone techniques for Foley, which is very rare. But in those instances, we have to get it right, like there. Like we cannot fix that later. Like, yeah, you can sum it to mono and then do the proper thing. But if you want it to work, like let's say we have to do a scene where it's LCR, and I very rarely have I had a chance to do this, but it happens. Sometimes in the past I've had to do scenes where we have 3 Neumann KMR 81s operating as LCR like across the front, and the Foley actually has to be performed live to how they want the LCR to play out as this immersive, like it's like an immersive trick. It's like we know it's easier just to shoot a mono and just like pan it, right? But in that instance, that was the effect they wanted to feel like distinct.
Yeah.
So
usually like the re-recording mixer would then pan the Foley then.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So very rarely is that's the other thing. Very rarely do Foley mixers actually write automation. Almost all of it's baked into the actual deliverable. So even if characters coming from far away to close perspective in camera, and they're blending like microphone signals in the room to get it so it feels like it's washed out, and then by the time we're up close, the mic perspective is closer. They're actually doing that on the fly, and it's printing to a mono track, and therefore the perspective is baked in. So if that Foley mixer takes too many risks and pushes it too hard, then sometimes they can get in trouble, and we have to re-record it one more time. So it's worth it though, because if your Foley mixer is really good, that gives them an opportunity to craft the mix better. And if we do it right when it gets delivered to mix, the mixer is relieved because they don't have to do more work to get it to have a perspective shift.
Totally. Thank you.
I had a quick question. You mentioned earlier, Joanna, about your mic pre that you used. What was that again?
We use a Millennia HV3D. And that's kind of been the standard for me since 2010. I've been very lucky. I've used Millennia HV3s for like most of my career. It's a sweet pre. It's just very clean, very fast, really good low end reproduction. It has these dual gain stages on it, so you get a lot of gain on tap. Only problem I have with the HV3D is that it's discrete in its gain staging, so you actually have to click it. And sometimes if you're on the fly, if you're Foley mixing and you're on the fly trying to adjust for gain, you can actually hear the volume step, and it can cause problems. So like, yeah, I mean, I love that preamp. I've tried a bunch too. Like you've tried Grace 808s. I've tried what other we tried Earthworks. Earthworks has a really cool clean pre that we've tried. At the end of the day, I think the HV3D has pretty much won out against most of the preamps I've tried in the past. Only thing I haven't had a chance to shoot it out against is like a Pueblo JR 4-4, which I know a lot of people love that preamp. Yeah, very popular in NorCal from what I remember.
Okay, thank you.
Dana wrote in the chat that it'd be fun to have a YouTube channel that presents short clips of movies with the Foley overdubbed comedically wrong. Does that already exist anywhere?
Well, there's a few really funny Foley bits. At the Museum of Moving Image in Queens, they have an interactive Foley section where obviously they actually have a Foley stage there for you to play around with like, you know, do an interactive exhibit, but they also have it's not maybe it's not Foley, but they have a segment where basically, yes, those are great. But they have a segment where basically you can replace all of the sound effects with different sound effects and just see how it plays back. And so there's a scene from Jurassic Park where the Velociraptor's stalking the kids in the kitchen, and you can replace all the footstep with basketball. Like you can replace like so it's like a really silly thing. But yeah, Greg, you bring up a good point. There's other videos that I really enjoy that emphasize Foley as a gag. Are the musicless music videos are a really funny thing. Some people started doing this thing where they'll take a music video, strip it of everything, and sound design and Foley, and do everything for it except for put the music back in. So you get these hysterical, like you get the scene from Footloose where Kevin Bacon is dancing by himself, and it's just the sound of like squeaks and panting and footsteps, and it's hysterical because he just looks like a madman, and there's no music to back it up. But
what are those called again?
Oh, those are called musicless music videos, and I'll send you my favorite one in the chat.
Great.
There's a bunch, but the funniest one I've seen is Footloose without music is pretty good. There's obviously people making fun of Michael Jackson too. That one's really funny.
breathe.
Okay.
I had one other quick thing I wanted to mention. There's been a number of times I've been on Foley stages in the Hollywood scene, and invariably, first thing you always see is this huge shoe rack with hundreds of shoes off in a corner somewhere, and then the other thing is car doors kind of mounted on wooden frames to slam. I was just curious if you had anything like that in there
Yeah,
in your world.
we have our corridor. We have one of 4 corridors here. So we have like a police cruiser corridor, civilian stuff. We also have parts that we stripped from a Camaro. The Foley team here is, or the sound department here is so fun. Like we'll go to a junkyard and just find whatever we need and tear it apart and bring it back in. And we're like paid to do it too, which is like absurd. Most foliars have to do that stuff like on the clock, or not on the clock. It's your own private collection. But it's been amazing being here and being like, hey, we need 2 more car doors because I can't say that. Some characters jumping between pieces of metal. So okay, cool. Then let's go get some more car doors. So we have car doors. In terms of the shoe rack, our shoe rack is located off camera, like right over there. It's all binned up right now because on some of the projects we're on, we've already established what shoes we need. So the rest of them get put into these cute little stackable bins. So like all my boots are in that one. Women's high heels are in that one. Another pair of boots I think are in that one. I can't see it from here, but I do love a good shoe rack. But this stage we're constantly fighting for space because we keep adding new stuff every single month. So it's getting packed in here.
And something else I remember on one Foley stage, I think it was at Warner Brothers. It was where they have to record glass, I guess glass breaking. So a bunch of plate glass in a bin, and it's all being broken up, and it's a really sharp, high frequency sounds. And you'd think that you would use a microphone like a small diaphragm condenser, or maybe even a ribbon, or something like that. But no, you know what they actually use that gets the sound they want, the crunchiness or whatever? Simply an SM57, a Shure SM57, a dynamic microphone, something you wouldn't think that they would use to capture crashing glass.
Yeah.
So just an interesting thought. It's contrary to what you'd think they would use for a microphone for that.
Yeah, big fan of the like MDR 421 for glass breaks. It's just some of those high transient sounds. No matter how much you click back on the pre, by the time you get to a place where there's no clipping, you've lost all the body and the explosiveness, right? And so, big fan of that. I'm a big fan of using unconventional microphones. I think there's too much of a reliance on some people being like, I just need to use a 416 or I just need to use an 81. And I'm just like, use what works, use what sounds right. Because at the end of the day, when the audience goes to see the film or play the game, they're not going to judge the Foley. They're not going to judge the Foley mic choice. They're just going to judge whether it sounds good or not, right? And thank goodness there isn't like a picture-in-picture in every single film I work on where you could see me like sweating, huffing and puffing and like smacking celery and stuff. It'd destroy the illusion. So I just think it's funny as like, I always tell people, I don't think Foley artists are defined by whether or not they use the best mic, or objectively the best mic. They're defined by what tools gave them the opportunities to perform the biggest possible ways to get the right sound. That's more important. It's a tool.
Oh, and speaking, one other thing that I you see a lot when they talk about how they recreate sounds, when you have people fighting and they're punching, socking each other, and they'll get a big slab of meat, a big steak, some juicy steak, and start slapping at that and punching at it. Do you use gross things like that in there?
All the time. We almost bought a $350 hydraulic lift so we can put a half a lamb up in here. And then we realized that the project we were going to do, they really didn't want the visual of that. So we ended up not doing it. But in the past, I've used hunks of yellowtail, like fish. Like I've used fish before for big slappy like stuff. I try to be vegan. I try to do it with like citrus fruits and like chamois. Like I think the chamois is the single greatest Foley prop in existence.
Chamois cloth?
Yeah, like a preserved sheepskin that they use to dry off cars.
Yeah.
I'm convinced that whoever figured that out probably worked a night shift as a car wash guy, because the chamois is fantastic. Like it is literally
What do you do with it?
anything. Just kidding.
No.
We do gore sound effects with the chamois because it
How?
retains enough water.
How?
Have one right over there. Give me like 1 second.
Okay, I'll spotlight you.
It's gonna
Okay,
sound
there's
pretty
a
gross.
chamois.
So here's a chamois. It's gonna sound a little bit gross right now, or it's gonna smell a little bit gross right now. It's been marinating in its.
We don't care about that.
There's no smell-o-vision, right? But,
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to keep talking while I do it, but you can basically just like get in there and get all this gooey, messy stuff. So like if we're doing somebody getting like their guts ripped out, like you know what I mean, like stuff like that. You know, we've used this stuff for like sticky gooey when I had to do the sound of like blood splattering in some projects and they want something thicker than water. We'll use this instead. We'll pitch shift it down a little bit and then just get like little drips. Let me see if I can get bigger drips on here and get it on mic, but it'd be like drip, 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 drip. So it's a really useful prop. Sometimes I'll wrap a boxing glove with this to try to simulate hitting a big side of steak. The cool thing about these is that they're preserved. They're preserved in fish oil, so we can keep one going for about 6 months before it starts turning colors, and then we have to throw it away. This thing is the MVP. Like, I'm so surprised when I started working for PlayStation, and I was talking to the sound designer who worked on Mortal Kombat 11, and this guy's a genius. This guy is incredible. His name's Steven Shapler, and he's a really good friend of mine now that I'm here at PlayStation. We've had a lot of chance to talk, but I mean, this guy's done all sorts of crazy stuff like fatality sounds for the Mortal Kombat games, and I showed him the chamois, and he lost his mind. He was like, I never knew that you could get those sounds out of one prop and that it doesn't rot. I'm like, it does rot, it just rots really slowly. But yeah, he was totally stoked because we had a lot of people are just go, okay, go get grapefruit, or okay, go get a watermelon, we'll pummel the crap out of it. But the chamois is great because you can get really, really intense control, and the longer you soak it, the more disgusting it becomes. John Post, who is like one of the most legendary Foley artists in the Hollywood world, he was known as the King of Gore. And something he would do was that at the beginning of the day, when they were trying to figure out how much was left to shoot or what to shoot that day, if he knew he was doing a lot of gore, he would drop a chamois into a bucket of water and let it juice up and marinate for as long as he could before he had to do a sound. And so he'd let it sit there for like sometimes a full day just to get it to be completely soaked and gross and disgusting. And yeah, it's the MVP prop, because with that one prop you can do guts, you can do blood, you can do viscera, you can do I've used it for food. If food's really disgusting, like let's say we're doing a scene where someone's serving soup and the soup is very like old and gross and like ploppity and sloppity, that the chamois is the king. Like I could do it with water, I could do it with wet paper towels to try to get some like velocity on it. But the chamois, oh my goodness, you put that into the sound of anyone eating, just doing like a mouth chew like effect. And if you do a mouth chew sound and like you go, again, it's pretty good food, and you just add that in underneath it, it instantly makes whatever they're eating disgusting. So
like how would you add that underneath?
Oh, I mean, obviously the first thing you'd do is you could definitely record a pass of just like your mouth moving in sync with their lips on camera, and then you would just go back in, open up a new track, put it in record, and I'd just perform it again, but with just the chamois. That way they can tone it. I've had directors where they will give them the full suite of like food sounds, and they'll mute all of it. They'll mute all of the eating because they don't want to hear eating. A lot of people, they get that intense reaction. So for chamois stuff, it's like those are the moments where we want to make sure that when it's performed, we give them as much discrete control after the fact. So if it turns out we went a little too over the top, they can always just mute one track and just be like, okay, no worries, we're just going to mute that one clip, and so that way
Is,
it's gross.
is the chamois all squishy stuff, or is there an impact thing too?
Yeah, I mean, it's all squishy, but if I want to do impacts, I'll wrap this around something a little harder. I've
Like
wrapped
the boxing glove.
boxing glove, right, like a purse, or
Oh,
funniest thing I use is, I don't know if you could see it. No, you can't. We have this massive piece of foam. It's big enough that I could sit on it like a love seat. I've actually in the past put this on top of it and smacked it, and you just get this big, tremendous like bass wave underneath it, and you get all the gooey, slappy, gross stuff.
so a large part of your career is generating gooey, slappy sounds.
Yeah,
Is that right?
yeah, I'd say
Wow.
so. It's
I,
it's that and eating.
I've got another little question here for you, if you could elaborate on what I somewhere along the line I learned that when I'm watching nature shows, and you know that that camera is a long ways away from the subject with a big zoom lens and all, there's no microphone up there, but you hear all these subtle little slapping of the water if a bird is playing at the seashore or something, you know, all these little things, and that's all added as Foley. Do you do things like that for nature programs?
Oh, yeah, all the time, all the
And
time.
all the time? And what kind of things you might elaborate on that would be in a nature show like that, and how you make those sounds?
Yeah, 100%. So I got to work on a movie a while ago about endangered, I think, was it rhinos? Yeah, it was about poaching. And we had to do the sound, it was a documentary, and we had to do the sound of like massive, massive crowds of elephants and rhinos and giraffes, because it was a documentary about how big game hunting is actually could potentially be sustainable if the funds for the licenses to kill these beautiful animals were used to preserve what remained of the population, which is a wild documentary. But we had to do all these galloping crowds of massive, massive creatures. And so when it came time for us to do the sound of the like of an elephant stampede, we used boxing gloves. We use boxing gloves for their hooves, because you're not going to hear the detail of the cartilage and the bone. You're going to want to hear the thump, and you're going to want to hear the rolling rumble. And so we did dozens of tracks of just holding, we're not wearing the boxing gloves and going like that, but we're holding the gloves like this, and we're hitting the dirt pit. It's a little too excessive for me to quickly demo. I'd have to pull a microphone over. But we've also done sounds where, you know, we got the elephants, but how about the giraffe? Giraffe's more like a horse. And so they have hooves. And so what we used to do is we had a pair of coconuts that we split in half, and we kept them perpetually frozen. They were in the freezer, and the only time you needed them, you had to go over there, open the freezer, grab the coconut halves. And it's not like Monty Python where they're hitting them together like this, but we'd get on the ground and we'd use the coconut halves as if they were hooves. And so, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that goes in nature documentaries. So much so to that Richard James Hinton is like a known Foley artist in the UK who did all of Planet Earth. Like he's the Planet Earth guy. And like I tell people, it's very impressionistic, because, you know, we can literally, you know, if we were so lucky, we could literally record, you know, we could put a 416 and a sound devices 702 and get really close to a lion. Sure, you can get that, and maybe you'll get some usable feet out of it. But if you want something that conveys the animal's, you know, story, the animal's narrative, how it walks, its performance, its gait, it's going to sound better to have a Foley artist shoot it anyways, even if you did manage to, I don't know, stick a lavalier on a tiger, right? So yeah, we did loads of that stuff. Animal feed are a huge bit. You know, I've done dozens and dozens and dozens of dogs. You put on a pair of gloves with you know, with paper clips at the end of it, taped to the end of it, and you tap it out and kind of follow their hips, and you kind of follow their feet and get the trot and the gallop and everything. But yeah, that stuff, people forget that sound is so hard to capture, right? So much of the presentation was about how harsh reality is. You put all this effort in, you get these awesome preamps, you get this sweet microphone, you get all up in there and you record it, and it sounds like a pipsqueak. you know. So in Foley, so much of the time we're just putting the gas pedal down. We're just creating a sound that is loud and expressive and is more performative than performative sonically. And that's what works. And that's unfortunately what we want out of a nature documentary. Otherwise, you watch if the nature documentary only had sound effect, or not even sound effects, if the nature documentary purely had verite sound, it would be so quiet because those guys are so small. And yeah, it would just be a mess. So
Well, just one other question related to that, going back to the small again. Let's say that you've got a long shot and it's a chipmunk, just a little chipmunk, and he's nibbling on an acorn or whatever, and you'll hear the little nibble sound that's obviously Foley. How would you create something like that?
it depends. I mean, so when it came time for doing animal eating, something I tend to do is, you know, our first pass is usually what we think will work, and then we kind of craft it from there, right? So in instances where I've had to do horses eating or any sort of animal eating, yeah, you know, the first thing I'm going to do is I'll get the carrot, or I'll get like almonds, or I get the closest analog to what they're eating and scale it up and then just perform it as a human. Other times so we start with that. Sometimes it's best to start with an exaggeration of what we see, just scale it up for a human consumption, right? Other times it doesn't quite work. You know, I had to do the sound of a cow chewing grass once upon a time. And so, you know, I got the celery out, I ate it on the stage with a microphone, and it just didn't quite work. What we realized is we were so used to hearing like the crunch was correct, but all the extra high grass detail as the grass like munches together and mixes together, we totally lost. We didn't have that. So I grabbed hay, and so we kept the pass of me chewing on celery, but then I grabbed some hay and then I performed their mouth movements with the grass in sync to pair up with the chewing sounds. So that way you get all the texture of the stuff moving, but you still get the actual sound of like teeth tearing into something.
Okay, so you're using your own teeth and your own mouth for that, but then overlaying the hay pass, so to speak. Wow, that's amazing.
All the time. You know, other times it's the lack thereof of the chosen material that works. Like when I have to do the sound of someone's fork coming out of the mouth, that's usually done with no food on it. You know, like just flicking the fork between my two front teeth and like getting the ping as it slicks out. Like that's a really fun sound, and getting the sound of like the mouth closing on a fork and that little kokunk, you know, we're so used to it because we live it, right? Anytime you eat, you're experiencing, like you're essentially close miking it with two of the best lavaliers that God's green earth have given you, and you're experiencing it through like the flesh and bone of your own teeth, right? So of course your perspective is going to be very extreme. But you know, when it comes time for us to try to replicate that on a Foley stage, I grab the fork and I have to overperform it. You know, I try not to close mic it sometimes. In fact, sometimes we try to keep the mic farther away just so that it doesn't feel close mic'd if that's not the intention. But in those situations, sometimes chewing with no food actually sounds better. You know, I've done a lot of eating cues in my career, and like there are a few things that you just can't cheat. Like I can't cheat crunchy vegetables. That's so hard to cheat. I can't just do that with nothing in my mouth. Like fresh French fries that have just the right amount of crunch to them is hard to cheat. Like I've used potato chips, I've used like burnt toast, and sometimes it just doesn't work. You just have to go and get fresh French fries to do that sound right. Other times it's like, no, just chew with your lips open and just like over accentuate that, and that works better than actually buying the salad or like getting the tuna. So
Fascinating.
That's an amazing hyper perception of audio reality that you have. I mean, those things are things that, like you say, we don't even think about them, but you've got to figure it all out.
Yeah, it's a lot.
That's remarkable.
I have a tape machine in my head running at all times.
Is there a typical amount of time allotted to a typical amount of project length for you to do this stuff?
Typically 33 minutes of program material translates to roughly about a day's worth of like recording work. but it varies all over the place, right? Like
Yeah.
doing like a Woody Allen film has different priorities than doing like a science fiction film, right? So like doing a walkie-talkie drama has its own unique difficulties and challenges than doing like, let's say, Guardians of the Galaxy, where they want you to blow up a spaceship, you know. So and obviously there are other situations where the sound effects editorial matters more than the Foley. So there are unexpected moments where, hey, maybe it is the Woody Allen movie that is tougher to do because there's such a higher emphasis on the Foley, right? So, but typically 33 minutes or roughly 30 minutes equaling a day's worth of work has been
Is
like
that an 8-hour day or a 12-hour day or?
8 hours, yeah. And that's
Yeah.
just recording. So that's not including the person who has to cue it and then the person who has to, and
Right.
the foliator has to cue it and then the foliator has to edit it, the Foleys afterwards. So
Right.
very roughly.
Okay, cool. Anybody have any other questions? This has been really great. Thank you so much for spending this extra time with us and getting into the details.
We'll never be able to watch a movie again without thinking about how these things are really created.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, imagine
Greg?
how I feel.
How do you feel in a movie
Well,
when you go to see a movie that you haven't done?
if it works, then, you know, I should be able to enjoy it like any other person, right? Like the Foley should feel very lived in. And I honestly notice more when the Foley is either missing or not quite correct, not quite matching what I see on screen. Those are the moments I notice it more. But for the most part, when the Foley's done really well, it honestly should feel transparent, as if it wasn't even there. There are moments though where exceptionally good Foley will have me cheering in theaters. Like I remember watching what movie was it? I remember watching The Social Network with a friend of mine, and the whole time I was like in theaters quietly going like this, yes. And it was for the simplest like stuff. It'd be like for someone walking down a hallway or somebody typing on the keyboard, and I'd just be like, yes. And my friend just didn't understand why I was cheering for these little random sounds that she just presumed was in the reality of the scene. So for me, sometimes really remarkably good Foley takes me out of it. It works for everybody else. Everyone else feels like it's a perfectly lived in sounding, natural sounding thing. But I've definitely had my fair share of moments where I will turn to look at the person sitting next to me and go, holy shit, that was amazing Foley.
Yeah,
You go, what?
the best visual effects are those that you don't notice.
Exactly.
Same thing with the Foley, I guess.
For video games, that's like UI, user interface sound design. When I listen to a video game and it's got good UI, it's just like, oh, that's so good. But it's one of those things that if you're not a video game sound designer, you just don't think about that kind of stuff.
Right. It's like the wine experts who they'll drink a particularly fantastic glass and they'll scream to the world how good it is. But as soon as someone else like me who doesn't necessarily have a appreciation for wine drinks it, I'll be like, oh, this is alcoholic grape juice. You know what I mean? Like it just wouldn't. It's nothing. Not even that remarkable. But you know. Anyways, it's been an amazing evening. I do have to get running because I can talk about Foley for like days on end. If given enough caffeine, I can. But
we'll work that out next time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joanna. And I do need to get going myself too. Thanks, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and end this meeting. Thanks for everybody for participating, and thanks again to Joanna for the excellent presentation and afterward.
Of course. Have a good one, everyone.
Bravo.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.